Hey, you lovely lot, and welcome back to Crime Analyst and the Intelligence Cell. Now, today I want to talk about Corey Micciolo, and I want to return to the case. Now, it's a case that's been on my mind a lot, and even though I've been travelling, I was working in Northern Ireland and also in London, I did talk about Corey in both places because this case really weighs heavy on me, and I know that so many of you feel the same as well. Now, closing arguments were today, so the 29th of May, and now it's in the hands of the jury. But I did want to give a quick recap of what came before, because for me, there are a number of witnesses that I think are significant and compelling in the case, and I watched them testify. And one of those people was an expert witness, Dr Anat Feingold, who is a specialist in infectious diseases, and she testified on the 22nd of May. Now, I just want to share what she said, and I think it's very important because she said that Corey left Jersey Shore Hospital at 1 a.m. on the 2nd of April. So remember, Brianna took him to hospital because she was so concerned. Well, she took him to see a pediatrician first of all, who then referred him to the hospital because they were so concerned with his injuries. But at 1 a.m. when he was discharged, it was noted that his bruises were concerning, but it was opined that he was a healthy child. Now, there were 3 evaluations by 3 different physicians, and they all said that he was healthy bar the bruising, and that they were very concerned to the point that Corey was going to be interviewed by a forensic interviewer, so someone trained in child abuse and trauma, on April the 2nd, so that day at 12 o'clock, and unfortunately he never attended that interview. And that to me is very important in this timeline. Timelines are very important in cases, and I've talked about that in my previous videos, so please do watch them. So the 3 evaluations by 3 different physicians, they said he's healthy, his bloods were taken, and there was no sign of infection, so that's really important. Corey is then taken to another ER, another hospital by Gregor, his biological father. And that's interesting to note that it was a different hospital from Jersey Shore. And I believe that that was intentional. And his blood was taken again, and his bloods proved negative for any bacteria. Now, Dr. Feingold ruled out sepsis as a cause of death. And she said that it was not an infectious diseases death. And that is very significant. And more so that she talked about a window of time. She talked about the 45 to 50 minutes before Corey's death, that there was no bacteria in his bloodstream. And that if it were a sepsis death, then his bloodstream should have been teeming with it, teeming with bacteria. It would have been very clear. And she said it was absent. So this is really important because the prosecution are arguing that Corey died of blunt force trauma, whereas the defence are arguing that he died of natural causes, that he died of sepsis and pneumonia, and he died of natural causes. So they're 2 different ends of the spectrum. Now, William Doyle also gave evidence, and I have to say I did find him to be very compelling and very credible. He was the triage nurse working when Gregor first brought Corey in, and he said that in terms of his demeanour, that he was stood sort of further back. He was near the revolving doors, and then he sort of edged his way forward, but he didn't know that it was an emergency situation. He said that there was no commotion, and he observed Corey in that he was limp and non-verbal, but there was no real talk of, urgency or no real panic coming from Gregor. And he was just clinically describing things. Well, William Doyle said that once he had moved and he was able to see Corey's face, he said that, and I'm going to quote him, he said that it was an all hands on deck case. But there was no urgency from Gregor. Now, most parents would be out of their mind with panic and desperate for a doctor to see him ASAP, to see your child. That's the normal response. But William Doyle said that wasn't Gregor. Now, he was a very compelling witness. And remember what I say, it's not always what people do, it's also what's absent, it's what they don't do. And then I just want to talk about Dr. Michael Baden. Now, he testified on the 28th, and I was very interested to see his testimony. And he was testifying for the defence, and Gregor was going to testify as well, and he decided not to. But Dr. Michael Baden did testify, and he made a point of going through all his credentials. He said that normally he would testify for the prosecution. And what's interesting, because that was a statement in and of itself, was that he didn't mention that he testified on behalf of O.J. Simpson. He testified for the defence in O.J. Simpson's trial. And so he doesn't always testify for the prosecution. But what he basically said was the opposite of Dr. Feingold, and the opposite of Dr. Thomas Andrew, and the opposite of Dr. Yang, who saw Corey on April the 1st. Now, he said that Corey's injuries were from CPR, so from doing the rigorous CPR, and he said the most likely cause of death was severe and rapid pneumonia, and that the manner of death was natural. Well, just to say something about that, for me, I found his testimony very awkward. I mean, he is very senior in his career now, but I just admittedly didn't buy what he was selling. And I don't know how much he was paid by the deep pockets of Gregor and his family, but for me, well, it wasn't as compelling as Dr. Thomas Andrew, certainly Dr. Yang or Dr. Feingold. And we have to remember that Dr. Feingold is actually the expert in infectious diseases. And she said 45 to 50 minutes before, when Corey's blood was taken, before his death, there was no bacteria in his bloodstream. So how rapid is Dr. Michael Baden saying this rapid pneumonia took hold? Is he saying it happened within a 45-minute window? I just find that very curious. I don't know whether there have been any other cases. And we also have to remember that when Corey was brought in, he was limp and non-verbal. So for me, that just doesn't tally. Whatever was wrong with Corey was wrong when he was brought in. And he was fine at 9 a.m. when Brianna dropped him off. He'd been seen at the hospital before. And so something happened between the window of Corey being dropped off 9 a.m. and the 3:30 appearing in the ER, when there's no sense of urgency, no sense of a commotion, no wild panic. So I just find that very odd, and it is at odds. And I hope the jury can find their way through the big name of Dr. Michael Baden, because for me, something's not adding up here. Corey, as I said, was limp and non-verbal. And therefore, that window, the couple of hours before he died, his bloodstream does not have bacteria in it. So obviously the prosecution is saying, and Dr. Andrews is saying that Corey died of blunt force trauma, and that's what his injuries were from, to his chest and his abdomen, and the laceration to his heart. And Dr. Michael Baden was saying that he would die very quickly from that injury, where Dr. Thomas Andrew basically said that no, it may well have been a number of hours because of exactly where that laceration was and the depth of that laceration. I also just want to add in, if you watch my video about Gregor's post-offence behaviour, for me that is also very significant when you layer that in. So the fact that he left the ER before Corey died, he left the hospital and he left the state. Well, I know the defence are saying that's because he was grieving, but I don't know any parent who has done that or would do that. So that's another anomaly. And then we've got the pre-offence behaviour. We've got the treadmill, the abuse that happened on the treadmill. So we know he didn't die from that abuse, but that's where those injuries came from. But what it talks to is targeted violence at the hands of Gregor towards Corey, the biting on the head, the cold and callous disregard for Corey. endangering his life. And I know the prosecution will make much of, not the prosecution, I know the defence have made much of, it was Corey who was still getting back up onto the treadmill and still carrying on. Well, yes, when a child has been groomed and they're looking for the approval of their dad and they're in a fear state, that's what they will do. That is not consent. Treadmills are not for children. He did it because of the fear of what would happen if he didn't. And he was being picked up and being put back on that treadmill, grooming, coercive control. And it makes me angry that that's what was being said, as if Corey wanted to do that. He did not want that abuse and that treatment. And as he was falling off each time and smacking his face on the actual treadmill and on the ground, and then he's being picked up by Gregor and placed back on there. And yes, at times he puts himself back on that treadmill, but that's what happens when fear is in the room and there's a power imbalance. And that much is extremely clear to me. So it's absolutely disgusting to say that this is something that Corey wanted. It's victim blaming, and it is absolutely inaccurate to say something like that for a child, a defenseless and innocent child who's being made to do something that he doesn't want to do. And I just read today that from Brianna that Corey had asked her why his daddy didn't love him. Corey knew, and it breaks my heart that he's being misrepresented now in his death. It is absolutely not okay. So I'm thinking, as always, about Corey. And my heart hurts, but I feel very enraged and angry. And I'm thinking about Brianna, and I'm thinking about all the people that loved Corey. And as I've said before, I want justice for Corey. And let's not forget the Gregor searches on his phone. The searches about the amount of time between an autopsy and filing murder charges when no one was talking about murder. That was on April the 4th, after Corey died on April the 2nd. Let's not forget he was he was on his phone searching if his phone could be tracked or if his car could be tracked. And I know that his defense lawyer, Mario Gallucci, has said, he's a grieving father, give me a break, who leaves the ER when his child is dying, who shows no urgency, who shows no real emotion, who then leaves not just the hospital but the state, and then he's searching very specific things on his phone which make it very clear there's a consciousness of guilt. So I hope the jury are paying attention. I really do, because sometimes when there's so much spaghetti thrown at the wall, it's hard to search out the significant pieces of information, and that's what the closing arguments are all about. And I know many of you have said that you wish that my video, the last one, the post-offence behaviour, was in the closing arguments for the prosecution. Well, it's a very important argument to make what his behaviour actually was. It makes the case itself about his guilt, and all the evidence points in one direction. So I'm going to leave it there, thinking about Corey and justice for Corey and thinking about his family. Until next time, be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instincts.